Welcome to Apex Storyteller, where peaceful stories guide you into a restful night. If you enjoy these tales, please like and subscribe to help me share more calming stories. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and the time. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin this relaxing journey together. Have you ever heard your name whispered in the wind, even though no one was there? Henry did. Alone in the forest, surrounded by towering pines and an unshakable feeling that he wasn't alone, he couldn't ignore the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and just close enough to make his heart race. What do you do when the darkness feels alive and it knows your name? Henry adjusted his backpack and stared at the dense forest ahead, its edges veiled in a mist that seemed alive, shifting and curling around the ancient trees like ghostly fingers. Everyone in town had warned him about Black Hollow Forest, a place steeped in chilling legends of people disappearing without a trace, of shadows moving without light. But Henry wasn't the kind to believe in stories, no matter how many warnings he received. Just a shortcut, he muttered to himself, gripping the straps of his pack. His friend Watson had dared him to take this route, claiming it would shave off hours from their planned hike. Now, standing at the entrance, Henry wasn't so sure. The trees swayed slightly, even though there was no wind, and the silence was unnaturally heavy. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of unseen things. As he stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the sound of his boots crunching on the underbrush echoed oddly, as if the forest were amplifying his every move. After a few minutes, the path became narrower, the trees closing in like they were watching him. His flashlight flickered briefly, and he froze. He told himself it was just a malfunction, but the sound that followed made his blood run cold, a low, guttural growl, far too close for comfort. He swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but twisted tree trunks and overgrown roots. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice shaking. The forest answered with silence. Then came the whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. "Henry." He whipped around, his heart pounding like a drum. "Who's there? This isn't funny." His own voice sounded foreign, strained with fear. There was no response, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but pride, and Watson's taunts, kept him moving forward. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little light the moon offered. The air grew heavy, making it harder to breathe, and the faint whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just his name anymore. There were voices, overlapping and incoherent, like a crowd murmuring just out of earshot. Henry's steps faltered when he saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in an eerie, pale glow. In the center stood a single, massive tree, its gnarled trunk carved with strange symbols that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The ground around it was littered with objects, old, rusted tools, broken toys, and faded photographs. As he approached, he noticed something else, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, like the tree itself was breathing. Against his better judgment, Henry reached out to touch the trunk. The moment his fingers brushed the rough bark, a shock ran through him, and his vision blurred. He stumbled back, gasping, as images flooded his mind, faces twisted in terror, hands clawing at the earth, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The forest was silent again, but the voices in his head weren't. "Run," they whispered. "Before it's too late." Henry staggered away from the tree, his heart racing. He turned to leave, but the path he had come from was gone, swallowed by the forest. In its place was a new trail, darker and more ominous, leading further into the unknown. He didn't have a choice. Gritting his teeth, he pressed on, every step fueled by a mix of fear and determination. Hours seemed to pass, though it could have been minutes. Time felt distorted here. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. And then he saw them, figures in the distance, standing perfectly still among the trees. They were human-shaped but wrong, their limbs too long, their faces obscured. As he moved closer, they didn't react. They just stood there, watching. "What do you want?" Henry shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. The figures didn't answer, but one of them lifted a hand, pointing towards something behind him. He turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his grip. There, etched into the dirt, was a message. The letters were crude, scratched hastily into the earth, but the meaning was clear: leave. Henry didn't need to be told twice. He broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tore through the underbrush. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and relentless, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When he finally burst out of the forest, the sun was rising, casting the world in a golden light that felt surreal after the nightmare he'd just endured. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, and looked back. The forest was still, silent, and unassuming, as if nothing had happened. But as he stood and began to walk away, he felt it, a weight in his pocket. With trembling hands, he reached in and pulled out a photograph. It was old, yellowed with age, showing a group of people standing in front of the massive tree he'd seen. And there, in the corner, was his own face, staring back at him. Henry's hands shook, and the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "You can't leave us, Henry. Not yet." The morning air was crisp, carrying a faint chill that clung to Henry's skin as he trudged away from Black Hollow Forest. The photograph he'd found weighed heavily in his pocket, its presence an unbearable reminder of what had happened, or what he thought had happened. The rational part of his mind screamed that it wasn't possible, that the forest couldn't have known his name, and yet, he couldn't ignore the proof pressed against his thigh. "Just a bad dream," he muttered, his voice shaky. But the tremor in his hand as he wiped sweat from his brow betrayed him. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figures from the forest trailing him. The woods stood still, innocuous, as though mocking his fear. He gripped the photograph again, unable to resist its pull. Stopping in his tracks, he pulled it out and stared. The longer he looked, the stranger it became. The faces of the others in the picture were faded, distorted as if smeared by an unseen hand. But his own face was perfectly clear, almost too clear, as though he had been digitally inserted into an image from another era. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered, scanning the faces. Who were these people? And why was he in their midst? He thought about Watson. Maybe his friend had played an elaborate prank. It would explain the dare, the eerie whispers, and the photograph. Watson always had a dark sense of humor. But how would Watson have known about this photograph? Henry folded the image and shoved it back into his pocket, the rough edges scratching his fingers. His house wasn't far, and he needed to get back, away from this madness. Yet, every step felt heavier, as if an unseen force was trying to pull him back toward the forest. By the time he reached his small, single-story home on the edge of town, the sky had shifted to a dreary gray, clouds gathering ominously. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, not even the usual hum of distant cars or the chatter of neighbors. The silence pressed against his ears like cotton. Once inside, he locked the door and drew the curtains, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort. Tossing his backpack onto the floor, he made his way to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. His reflection in the stainless steel fridge caught his eye, and he froze. There was something off about it. His reflection wasn't moving in sync with him. It tilted its head, just slightly, while Henry stood perfectly still. "No," he whispered, stepping back. He blinked, and the reflection snapped back to normal, mirroring his every move. His breathing quickened. He tried to shake it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. But the sense of being watched refused to leave him. The silence in the house was oppressive, and the ticking of the clock on the wall grew louder, each second drilling into his skull. To distract himself, he pulled out the photograph again, this time examining it under the bright kitchen light. The symbols carved into the massive tree in the image seemed to shimmer faintly, almost as if alive. His stomach churned as he realized the symbols were shifting, rearranging themselves before his very eyes. He grabbed his phone to take a picture, hoping to prove to himself later that he wasn't losing his mind. But the screen froze when he aimed it at the photo, the camera app refusing to open. Frustrated, he looked back down, only to find that the photograph was now blank. "What the hell?" he muttered, flipping it over. Nothing. Both sides were completely empty, as if the image had never existed. His phone buzzed suddenly, startling him. A message from Watson lit up the screen. "Dude, where are you? Been waiting all morning." Henry frowned. Watson was supposed to be waiting at the trailhead, but he had never mentioned meeting him after the hike. Shaking his head, Henry decided to call him. The phone rang twice before a distorted voice answered. "Henry." It wasn't Watson. The voice was low and gravelly, filled with a static that made Henry's skin crawl. "Who is this? Where's Watson?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The line crackled, and the voice replied, "You shouldn't have touched the tree." Henry's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? Who is this?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it said one word before the call disconnected. "Stay." The word echoed in his mind, and the whispers began again, faint but growing louder, as if they were right outside his door. Panicking, Henry dropped the phone and grabbed the curtains, yanking them aside. The street was empty. But at the far edge of his yard, just beyond the picket fence, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with arms that hung too low and a face obscured by shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch as Henry stared at it. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost curiously, before raising one long arm to point back toward the forest. "No," Henry muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not going back there." The figure remained still, its hand unwavering. The whispers intensified, filling his ears, drowning out every other thought. "You have to return, Henry," they said. "You belong to us now." His knees buckled, and he clutched the edge of the table to steady himself. When he looked back out the window, the figure was gone, but the whispers remained, now coming from inside the house. Terrified, Henry stumbled back, his eyes darting around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and move, coalescing into shapes that weren't quite human. "Get out," he whispered to himself, barely able to think over the noise. He grabbed his car keys and bolted for the door, throwing it open. The moment he stepped outside, he froze. The forest was there, impossibly close, its edge now mere feet from his house. The mist curled out like claws, reaching for him. "No," he whispered again, backing away. But the ground beneath him shifted, and he realized with horror that the grass had turned to dirt. His house, his street, everything he knew was gone. He was standing at the entrance to Black Hollow Forest once more. The whispers turned into laughter, low and cruel. The photograph appeared at his feet, its image restored. This time, it showed only one face, his own, eyes wide with terror. And below his image, scratched in jagged letters, was the same message he had seen before, leave. But there was no path back this time. Henry's pulse pounded like a war drum as he stood at the forest's edge, paralyzed by the impossible sight of Black Hollow Forest surrounding him again. His house was gone. The street, the town, everything familiar had vanished as though erased by the forest's will. He wanted to believe it was all a nightmare, that he'd wake up drenched in sweat in his bed. But the cold bite of the mist on his skin told him otherwise. "Think, Henry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But the laughter, the low, mocking laughter, told him he was wrong. The photograph at his feet seemed to pulse faintly, a sickly glow emanating from the symbols on the massive tree in the image. He bent down reluctantly, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The moment his skin touched the photograph, the world shifted. The laughter stopped. The air around him thickened, suffocatingly heavy, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time, they weren't content to murmur incoherently. "You shouldn't have come back. You're ours now. Run, but you won't escape. Stop!" Henry screamed, clutching his head. The whispers subsided momentarily, replaced by an eerie stillness. When he lowered his hands and opened his eyes, the forest had changed again. The mist was thicker now, curling around his ankles like shackles. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches intertwining to form a jagged canopy that blocked out the sky. The path ahead was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of roots and underbrush. And then he saw them, the shadows. They darted between the trees, too fast to catch with his eyes but unmistakably there. He felt their presence, their hungry gazes boring into him from every direction. The photograph in his hand grew warm, and when he looked at it again, the image had changed. The tree was still there, but now there was a figure standing beneath it. A boy, no older than 10, staring directly at the camera. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Who are you?" he whispered, as if the boy could hear him. The boy didn't move, but something about the image felt alive, as if the figure might step out of the photograph at any moment. A sudden rustling behind him made Henry whirl around. The flashlight he hadn't realized he was still holding flickered weakly as he scanned the dense undergrowth. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. There was no response, only the growing sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, approaching from the darkness. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles turning white. "Stay back," he shouted. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Henry aimed the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the shadows. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the light. It wasn't human. The thing was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and jointed at unnatural angles. Its face, or what passed for one, was a featureless void, a black emptiness that seemed to pull the light toward it. Henry's legs felt like jelly, but instinct overrode his terror. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words now a chaotic chorus of warnings and threats. Don't look back. Keep running, Henry. You'll never escape. He didn't need to be told twice. His lungs burned as he sprinted, branches tearing at his clothes and face. The forest seemed alive, the trees shifting and moving to block his path. He stumbled and fell, the photograph slipping from his grasp and landing face up in the dirt. When he scrambled to pick it up, he froze. The image had changed again. Now it showed him, not a version of him from the past, but him, here and now, sprawled in the dirt with fear etched on his face. And behind him, towering over his fallen form, was the shadowy figure. Henry's blood turned to ice as he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at him to run, he turned his head. Nothing was there. The forest was silent again, the oppressive quiet pressing down on him like a weight. He stood shakily, clutching the photograph, and looked around. The path ahead was clear now, illuminated faintly by a pale, unnatural light. "Why me?" he whispered to the emptiness. "What do you want from me?" The only answer was the hum. Low and rhythmic, it vibrated through the ground, pulling him forward like a siren's call. Against his better judgment, Henry followed the sound. The forest seemed to guide him, the trees parting to reveal another clearing. In its center was the massive tree from the photograph, its gnarled trunk glowing faintly with those same shifting symbols. And beneath it stood the boy. Henry's breath hitched. The boy looked exactly as he had in the photograph, small, fragile, and terrified. But now his lips moved, forming words Henry couldn't hear. I don't understand," Henry stammered, stepping closer. The boy raised a trembling hand and pointed to the base of the tree. Henry followed the gesture and saw something half buried in the dirt. It was a book, its cover cracked and weathered with age. The hum grew louder as Henry reached for it, his fingers brushing against the worn leather. The moment he touched it, the world around him dissolved into darkness. He was no longer in the clearing. The air was thick and suffocating, the ground beneath him cold and hard. Shadows swirled around him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. The book in his hands felt heavier now, its pages glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "Read," a voice commanded, deep and resonant, vibrating through his very bones. "I don't want to," Henry said, his voice barely a whisper. "Read," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. Henry hesitated, then opened the book. The pages were blank at first, but as he stared, words began to appear, scrawled in jagged handwriting that seemed to bleed onto the paper. "The forest doesn't let go. The forest doesn't forget. And neither will you." The shadows closed in, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. Henry screamed, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. He was back in the clearing, the book gone from his hands. The boy was gone too, leaving Henry alone with the tree and the unrelenting whispers in his mind. This time, the message was clear: "You can't leave, Henry. You belong to us." Henry's knees buckled as he clutched his head, the whispers burrowing into his mind like claws. His breaths came in shallow gasps, the forest around him a spinning, suffocating blur. Every instinct told him to flee, to escape this nightmare, but where could he go? The forest was alive, shifting, and he was its prey. He staggered back from the tree, its symbols glowing faintly in the misty clearing. The whispers ebbed slightly, but the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his back never left. As he stumbled toward the newly formed path, he heard it again, that mocking laughter. This time, it was closer. "Show yourself!" Henry screamed into the dense shadows, his voice cracking with desperation. The forest didn't answer, but the mist moved, curling unnaturally into shapes that almost resembled faces, distorted and agonized. His flashlight, weak and flickering, only deepened the shadows, and he cursed under his breath. The photograph in his pocket felt heavier, almost like it was pulling him down. He pulled it out, reluctant but curious. The image had changed again. The boy was gone, replaced by another figure, this time, a man, his face obscured by shadow. But Henry recognized something chillingly familiar about the shape of his frame. The man's hand extended toward the edge of the photograph, as though inviting Henry to follow. "No," Henry muttered, his voice shaky. "I'm not playing your game." The forest had other ideas. The symbols on the tree pulsed once, their light spreading through the ground like veins of fire. The path ahead darkened, and a low hum began to build, vibrating through Henry's chest. He turned to run, but the moment he moved, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, crashing into darkness. When Henry awoke, he was lying on cold, wet earth. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and his head throbbed with pain. He groaned and sat up, blinking against the oppressive darkness. His flashlight was gone, but faint bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls around him, casting an eerie green glow. He was in a tunnel, its walls jagged and unnatural, as if carved by something with claws instead of tools. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the narrow space, and the whispers were back, softer, almost beckoning. "Keep moving," they urged. "You're almost there." "Almost where?" Henry whispered, his voice trembling. The only answer was a distant sound, a rhythmic tapping, like nails on stone. It grew louder with each passing second, echoing down the tunnel. Henry's pulse quickened as he forced himself to his feet. His body ached, his legs wobbly, but fear was a powerful motivator. He moved cautiously, his hand brushing against the slimy walls for support. The tapping was relentless, growing louder and closer. His mind raced with possibilities, another trick of the forest. Or something worse. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and atop it lay the book he had seen earlier. Its pages fluttered, though there was no breeze, and the symbols on its cover glowed faintly. Surrounding the pedestal were figures, 10 of them, standing perfectly still. They were humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their skin pale and translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. Their faces were featureless, but Henry could feel their gaze boring into him. His instincts screamed to turn back, but the whispers urged him forward. "You've come so far, Henry. Don't stop now." As he stepped into the cavern, the figures moved, their heads snapping toward him in unison. The tapping sound stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around. "I don't want this," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they parted, creating a path to the pedestal. The book seemed to pulse with life, its glow intensifying. Henry hesitated. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was a trap, but something about the book called to him. He took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was standing before the pedestal. The whispers in his mind were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging him to open the book. With trembling hands, he reached out. The moment his fingers touched the cover, the cavern was plunged into darkness. Henry gasped, his heart pounding as the ground beneath him shifted. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, a voice spoke, not a whisper, but a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You've made your choice, Henry." "I didn't choose anything," he shouted, panic rising in his chest. The voice chuckled darkly. "You've been chosen, then. It doesn't matter. The forest has claimed you." The ground trembled, and the figures moved closer, their limbs bending unnaturally as they reached for him. Henry stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. The cavern walls seemed to close in, the bioluminescent fungi flickering like dying embers. In his desperation, he opened the book. The pages were blank at first, but then words appeared, scrawled in blood-red ink. "Your story begins anew. The forest does not forget." The cavern dissolved around him, replaced by the familiar sight of the clearing. The massive tree loomed overhead, its symbols glowing faintly. The boy was there again, staring at him with hollow eyes. But something was different. The boy smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "You're one of us now," he said, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. Henry tried to speak, but no words came out. He looked down at his hands and froze. His skin was pale, almost translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. His limbs felt strange, elongated and unfamiliar. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "This isn't real." But it was. The whispers returned, louder than ever, as the forest closed in around him. He was no longer an outsider. He was part of it now, a shadow among shadows, a prisoner in Black Hollow Forest. And as the sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light on the seemingly peaceful woods, Henry's screams faded into the silence, swallowed by the forest's eternal darkness. Henry's consciousness flickered like a dying light bulb. His mind, once sharp, once his greatest ally, was now a chaotic mess of fragmented thoughts and half-formed memories. His skin still felt wrong, as though he were no longer entirely human. The whispers were constant, curling around him like the roots of the trees, seeping into his very being. They weren't just outside anymore, they were inside him. "You can never leave," they murmured, their voices impossibly close, their breath cold against the back of his neck. "You belong to the hollow now." He wanted to scream, to fight, to run. But his body, his limbs, were no longer his own. They moved of their own accord, as though they had become puppets, strings pulled by an unseen force. The clearing had shifted, the world around him warping in ways that defied logic. The trees, twisted and ancient, leaned in closer, their gnarled branches reaching toward him like fingers, as though to claim him. His breath came in shallow, jagged bursts, panic swelling in his chest. The massive tree, the tree, loomed over him, its symbols pulsing with that sickly light. Beneath its bark, something writhed, something alive, something that wasn't supposed to be. The air around him buzzed with an oppressive energy, like the atmosphere itself was about to collapse in on him. The pressure was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity. No. Henry tried to take a step back, but his legs refused to cooperate. He was rooted to the spot, as if the very soil had risen to claim him. The whispers came again, louder now, frantic and desperate. The figures surrounding the tree shifted, their bodies blurring, elongating, distorting like broken marionettes. They were moving in unison, swaying toward him, and their faces, those empty, hollow faces, were now twisted in grotesque, mocking smiles. Henry could feel their eyes on him, their unblinking, soulless stares boring into his mind, twisting his thoughts. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping to block out the horror, but it only made it worse. Their presence grew like a dark fog, suffocating him. He had to get away. But there was nowhere to run. The voices filled his mind, suffocating all rational thought. You cannot escape. You were always meant for this. A sharp pain flared in his chest, and he gasped, clutching at his shirt. Something was happening, something inside him was changing. His heart raced, pounding in his ears, as if it was trying to escape his chest. His body felt like it was on fire, the sensation spreading outward, consuming him. His fingers, trembling, reached up to his face. His skin was peeling, sloughing off in flakes, revealing something beneath, pale, translucent flesh. His heartbeat quickened. He wanted to scream. He tried, but no sound came. His throat tightened, suffocating him. You're becoming one of us. Henry collapsed to his knees, his vision swimming. The forest swirled around him, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The figures, no longer human, surrounded him, their movements a sickening dance. They reached out with long, skeletal hands, pulling at him, dragging him into the shadows. He fought, struggling against the hands that pulled at him from every direction. But they were too strong. Every time he tried to push them away, their grip tightened, their touch colder, more insistent. The whispers drowned out all other thoughts, their words becoming a maddening chant, an unending litany of despair. There is no escape. You will never be free. You will never leave this place. The world tilted, spinning faster and faster, until Henry couldn't tell where the ground was anymore. His body felt light, detached, floating as though the very essence of his being was being stripped away. The whispers intensified, growing more and more frantic, until they were deafening. And then, the world stopped. Everything was still. The figures stood motionless, their empty eyes fixed on him. The forest had fallen silent. The whispers had ceased. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused, holding its breath. Henry dared to look up, his body shaking. There, standing at the center of the clearing, was the tree. It wasn't like before. Now, it was alive, its branches twisting and shifting like tendrils, its bark pulsing as though it had a heartbeat. He couldn't tear his eyes away. It felt hungry. Welcome home, a voice echoed, the words reverberating through his bones. Henry's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't from the figures, nor from the whispers. It was deeper, more powerful, something ancient, something otherworldly. He stumbled to his feet, but it wasn't his will that moved him. His legs obeyed the command of the forest, carrying him forward, toward the tree. The ground beneath him seemed to reach up, pulling him closer. With every step, the world around him shifted. The air thickened. His chest tightened as if the very atmosphere was choking him. You have been chosen. The voice filled him again, not in his ears, but in his mind. The ground rumbled beneath him, and the figures began to move once more, their forms shifting in ways that defied reality. They were circling him now, their faces contorted into grotesque, impossible shapes. The tree stretched its limbs toward him, branches reaching out like claws. Henry was standing before it now, powerless to resist. The ground around him seemed to bend and shift, warping reality itself. And then, the whispers came again, rising to a fever pitch, shaking the very core of his being. You will join us. Henry gasped, the words searing into his mind. He tried to scream again, to fight, but there was no point. The tree's branches closed around him, enveloping him in darkness. And as he was pulled into its cold embrace, the forest whispered one last time, its words chilling to the bone. It's too late. Henry's world collapsed into darkness. One moment, the tree's cold embrace had surrounded him, its branches wrapping around his body like the fingers of a predator, pulling him into the inky void. The next, everything was silent, deafeningly so. The whispers had ceased. The twisted figures that had circled him were gone, swallowed by the shadows, leaving nothing but the oppressive blackness. His limbs were still, his body frozen, as though suspended in time. Am I dead? The thought crossed his mind, but it felt too real, too vivid to be the end. He could still feel the weight of his heartbeat, still feel the cold sweat slicking his skin, still hear the faint ringing in his ears. The stillness was suffocating, but it didn't feel like the peace of death. It felt like the quiet before something far worse. Wake up, Henry. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was like a whispering breeze and a rumbling thunderstorm, both distant and immediate. It clawed at his mind, wrapping around him like the branches of the tree, pulling him back from the edge of oblivion. Henry's eyes shot open, but the world before him was still dark, only now it wasn't empty. There was movement, a flicker of light in the distance, dancing like the last remnants of a dying flame. He took a breath, and the air was thick, almost tangible, like he was inhaling something alive. Where am I? He tried to stand, but his body was unresponsive, frozen in place. Panic flooded his chest as he realized his limbs were locked, like they had been encased in stone. His chest tightened. His heart beat faster, and the weight of fear pressed down harder. There was something else, too, a creeping sensation, an awareness of something just out of reach, something that wasn't quite right. And then, from the darkness, came the sound. It was soft at first, like the scratching of nails against wood. Slow. Relentless. But as it grew louder, Henry felt his spine tighten, his entire body trembling in terror. It wasn't the sound of a living creature. No, it was something far worse, something unnatural, like the grinding of stone against stone, or the slow slide of something dead across the floor. He strained against the stone-like paralysis, desperate to move, desperate to flee, but it was useless. The darkness was closing in, squeezing tighter, drawing him in with each passing second. Henry. The voice again. He couldn't place it. It wasn't the whispers that had filled his mind earlier, nor the strange, hollow voices of the figures. It was something different, something almost familiar. His chest heaved, and he finally managed to twist his head, looking for the source. The flickering light had moved closer, shimmering like a pale candle in the distance. He wasn't alone. Who's there? A shadow moved within the glow. Henry's breath hitched, and his body went rigid. The figure that emerged was almost human, but not quite. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs that stretched too far, too thin, as if it had been twisted and bent to fit some unnatural shape. Its face was hidden beneath a mass of tattered, black cloth, but Henry could see its eyes. Hollow. Empty. Black voids that swallowed any hint of light. It stepped forward, and with each movement, the darkness seemed to shift around it. It wasn't just moving through the space, it was bending it, as if the world itself was warping under its presence. The creature's lips parted, and Henry's heart stopped. It's not over. The words were spoken in a voice that crawled under his skin, a voice that echoed in the depths of his mind. It wasn't a sound he heard, but something he felt. It resonated with the very essence of his being, a force that turned his stomach and made his blood run cold. You never left. You never escaped. The figure took another step forward, its long fingers stretching toward Henry. The air seemed to pulse with every movement it made, an invisible force that pushed him back even as he tried to advance. But there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in the endless dark, his body still paralyzed, unable to move. Every fiber of his being screamed for escape, but it was as though the very fabric of reality had wrapped itself around him, keeping him in place. The creature's hand hovered just inches from his face, and Henry could feel its presence as though it were pressing against his skin. The heat from its body was intense, oppressive. The stench of decay filled his nose, rotting flesh and something far worse, like the very air itself had become poison. His stomach churned, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate under the weight of it all. "You thought you could leave," the figure said, its voice dripping with contempt. "But the hollow doesn't let go. Once you step inside, you're never truly free." Henry's mind was reeling. He had thought he'd escaped, left the cursed forest. He had seen the light of dawn. He had breathed the fresh air of the outside world. But now, as he faced this twisted being, he understood. He hadn't escaped at all. "You belong here," the figure whispered. "And soon, you will understand why." The ground beneath Henry's feet trembled, and the air crackled with an energy he couldn't comprehend. The figure moved again, its hand now brushing against his face. He recoiled, but it was as though the movement had no effect, as if he were tethered in place by invisible chains. "No. I can't stay here. I won't be a part of this. I won't." But the voice, the creature's voice, slithered into his mind, soothing, coiling around his thoughts like a poisonous vine. "You are a part of the hollow now. We all are." And then, as if the words had power of their own, Henry's body went still once more. The creature's eyes, those endless voids, locked onto his, and in them, Henry saw something. Something that made his blood run colder than it had ever been before. It was a reflection. His reflection. But it wasn't his face. It was distorted, twisted. The figure before him now wore his face, his eyes, but it wasn't him. It was something else, something far worse. His heart raced. His breath came in shallow gasps. "It's already begun," the creature whispered, and the world around him twisted once more. The suffocating air around Henry seemed to grow thicker, like it was pressing in from all sides, every inch of it suffused with an undeniable heaviness that pulled at his chest. His mind reeled. "This isn't real," he thought, but the distorted reflection of himself, the hollow-eyed version, stared back at him, sending a wave of terror coursing through his veins. The creature's cold fingers, still hovering by his face, seemed to cling to his every thought. His pulse raced. His body was trapped, frozen in place by the pressure of the creature's presence, but his mind screamed for release. "I need to get out of here," Henry thought desperately, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of a way out. But the dark space around him was endless, an expanse of void and shadow where nothing made sense. The glowing flicker of light from before had vanished, leaving him stranded in a suffocating blackness. The whispers were gone too, replaced by an eerie stillness that made his skin crawl. The creature, the thing that had worn his face, took another step closer. Its long, twisted limbs moved unnaturally, as though it was more a shadow than a solid being, its form warping and shifting with every movement. Henry could feel its eyes on him, even though he couldn't see them anymore. He could feel the weight of its gaze, burning into his soul. "Do you know who you are now, Henry?" The voice, that same slithering whisper, crawled under his skin. The air around him seemed to hum with it, a frequency that rattled his bones. Henry swallowed, the panic rising in his chest, but he couldn't find his voice. His lips moved, but no sound escaped. The weight of the creature's gaze intensified, and then, in the silence, the words began to pour into his mind like poison. You thought you could leave. You thought you were different, that you could escape. But you're not, Henry. You are one of us now. You always were. You belong here, in the hollow. The last words sent a shudder through his spine. No, Henry thought. No, I can't be like them. I can't. But before he could finish his thought, the creature reached out again, its long fingers curling around his wrist. The contact sent a shockwave of cold through his body, as though his very blood was freezing in his veins. The pain was unbearable, sharp, burning, but as his vision blurred, the creature's form seemed to stretch and distort in front of him. Its voice, low and guttural, filled the air like a chant. The hollow has claimed you. You're not just trapped, Henry. You are the hollow now. His thoughts collided in a chaotic whirlwind, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening, of what he was hearing. The tree. The symbols. The faces. The whispers. It was all tied together. The hollow had always been here, had always wanted him. And now, it was dragging him deeper into its depths. Henry's eyes locked onto the creatures, and for the first time, he could see the truth behind the abyssal voids. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a reflection of something ancient, something that had existed long before Henry ever stepped foot in Black Hollow Forest. Something that had waited for him. The creature wasn't merely a guardian of the hollow. It was the hollow itself, an embodiment of all the terror, all the sorrow, all the souls that had been lost here. And now, Henry was one of them. His body shook with the overwhelming realization. The creature's fingers tightened, digging into his skin like claws, pulling him in closer. His stomach churned with nausea, his limbs heavy with the weight of the hollow's hold. It felt like the forest had swallowed him whole, like it had become part of him, and there was no escape from its grasp. You will never leave, the creature hissed, its voice now a low growl in the back of Henry's mind. Not alive. Not sane. Suddenly, the forest around him seemed to shift. The blackness lifted, but it wasn't the light of the world outside that returned. It was something worse, a deep, unsettling crimson glow that bathed the landscape in an unnatural light. The trees stood like twisted sentinels, their bark dark and slick with some black substance. The ground beneath Henry's feet was no longer solid. It was soft, like the forest floor was breathing, pulsing with a life of its own. Before Henry could move, the ground trembled beneath him. The trees shifted, their branches creaking and groaning as if they were stretching toward him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, no, someone. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the crimson glow. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He recognized them. Watson. The figure, though a mere silhouette, seemed too familiar. It was his friend, the one who had dared him to take the shortcut, the one who had never returned. But this wasn't the Watson Henry remembered. The figure was different, pale, hollow-eyed, and standing unnaturally still. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched. Henry's chest tightened. He called out, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the hollow. Watson didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge him. It was as if he was trapped in this hellish world, a puppet of the hollow, just like everyone else who had dared to enter. Watson. Henry shouted, the desperation creeping into his voice. "What happened to you?" The figure's head tilted, and then it took a step forward. One step. Then another. It wasn't Watson anymore. It was the hollow taking form, mocking Henry's every effort to escape. The ground beneath Henry's feet trembled again, but this time, it wasn't just the earth shifting. There was something else, a pull, like gravity had reversed itself, and the world was dragging him downward. The air grew thick again, suffocating him with its weight, and the sound of his heartbeat thundered in his ears. In that moment, Henry realized what was happening. He wasn't just trapped in the hollow. He was becoming part of it, slowly, painfully, inexorably. The figure of Watson continued to advance, each step an echo of his own inevitable fate. And then, as the darkness crept in again, Henry heard it. The whispers, but this time, they weren't just around him. They were in his mind. In his bones. "You never left, Henry. You never will." With one final, horrifying scream, Henry was pulled into the ground. The forest swallowed him whole. Have you ever thought that the digital world was safe? That behind the glowing screens and lines of code, there's nothing but logic and order. Sam, an IT software engineer, once believed that too. But when a strange, corrupted program showed up on his system one night, untraceable, unexplainable, he couldn't resist opening it. Little did he know, the more he dug into the code, the more it began to change him. At first, it was small things, glitches, errors, the occasional flicker of the screen. But then, things started to happen in the real world. And now, Sam can't tell where the code ends, and reality begins. What he's about to uncover is something far darker than just a bug. But will he be able to stop it before it's too late? The cold air in the server room felt like it was pressing against Sam's chest, suffocating him. His mind raced, his thoughts scattered, but the image of the shadow in the corner of the room, how it had disappeared, or had it really disappeared, was burned into his mind. The chill lingered in the room like an unseen presence, a weight that crushed his every breath. Sam's hand shook as he reached for his phone, trying to call Watson. His thumb hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to press the call button. He knew what Watson would say. The rational thing. The "it's just a glitch" response. He had heard it 1,000 times before, every time the system acted up, but this was different. He could feel it. Deep in his gut, the sensation of being watched, the sensation of being hunted, hadn't left. He had to get out of this room. Sam turned around and quickly left the server room, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway felt too long as he made his way back to his desk, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. When he finally reached his office, he slammed the door shut behind him. The sound reverberated in the empty space, as if something was trying to break through. He stood there for a moment, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He wiped it away, trying to clear his mind. That figure, that whispering hum, it couldn't have been real, could it? But the feeling, the coldness in the room, was something Sam couldn't ignore. The computer monitor in front of him flickered to life again. He hadn't touched it. He hesitated before sitting down, glancing around the room, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. But then he saw it, the file. The corrupted file. It was open again on the screen, the text flashing faster than before. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. How had it reopened itself? He had closed it. He was sure of it. The file shouldn't even have been there. He hadn't saved it, hadn't executed anything. He hadn't even tried to open it again. But there it was, taunting him. "Why can't I get rid of you?" Sam whispered to the screen, his voice barely a breath. The letters on the screen seemed to shift, changing in ways that shouldn't be possible. A single line of text emerged, more terrifying than anything before. "You're not alone, Sam. You never were." Sam's pulse quickened, his vision narrowing. His hands, cold and clammy, hovered over the keyboard, unsure of whether he should type something, anything, to make the nightmare stop. But as his fingers moved toward the keys, the screen flashed with another message. "I'm inside your code now. I know everything. I see you." Panic surged through Sam. He quickly pulled his hands away, but it was too late. The screen seemed to stretch, contorting as if something was trying to break free from it. The words on the screen began to rearrange themselves, faster than he could read them. They weren't just random letters. They were sentences, coherent messages, things only he would understand. A sharp knocking sound echoed through the walls. Sam spun around, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. The door. Someone was knocking at his door. But who could it be at this hour? He swallowed hard, trying to calm himself. Maybe it was just Watson, coming to check on him after the strange message he sent. But as he approached the door, he felt that same oppressive feeling again, the one that made his skin crawl. The knock came again, louder this time. Desperate. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling. As soon as his hand made contact, the room seemed to grow colder. A strange pressure filled the air, as if the space was closing in on him. He swung the door open with force. There was no one there. No Watson. No one. Just the empty hallway, as silent as a graveyard. But that wasn't what made his heart stop. It was the faint trail of dark, oily liquid that snaked across the floor, leading toward his desk. Sam backed away, his mind racing. "This isn't real," he whispered. "This can't be real." But the liquid, it didn't make sense. It wasn't like any water or oil he had seen before. It seemed to shimmer in the light, almost as if it were alive. Sam slowly moved toward it, his breath shallow. His mind was telling him to run, to leave the office, to never look at that file again. But he couldn't stop himself. Something was pulling him toward it, like an invisible force. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the dark stain on the floor. It was cold. So cold. Suddenly, his phone vibrated again, breaking the silence. He jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He quickly checked the screen, hoping it was Watson, some kind of rational explanation for what was happening. It wasn't Watson. It was a message, a simple line of text from an unknown number. "It's too late to fix it now. The code has already been written." Sam's blood ran cold. His vision blurred, and the room began to spin as the words on his screen flashed again. "You can't escape me. I know you, Sam. I know what you fear." The hum returned, louder now. It came from everywhere. The walls. The ceiling. His own mind. Sam stood up, feeling dizzy, as the office lights flickered above him. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as though something was breathing down his neck. And then the computer screen went black. For a split second, everything stopped. The hum, the noise, the strange sensation that something was watching him, it all ceased. Then, the screen flickered back to life. And the words appeared. "I'm coming for you, Sam. And when I do, you'll never be the same. The room felt suffocating, each breath Sam took shallow and labored. His mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. What was happening? How was the code doing this to him? It couldn't be real, could it? He had to be imagining it. But the evidence was everywhere. Sam sat at his desk, his eyes glued to the now blank screen in front of him. He hadn't touched it, hadn't even opened the corrupted file again. Yet, there it was, that same unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. The hum. The cold. It was all still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for him to slip. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to shake off the dread that clung to him like a shadow. Every inch of his skin prickled with a sense of impending doom, like someone, or something, was watching, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way he thought. The phone in his hand buzzed again, almost as if it was mocking him, forcing him to acknowledge the presence that had invaded his life. Sam looked down, already knowing who it was. His heart dropped as he saw the same unknown number. He was afraid to open it, but at the same time, he couldn't stop himself. His thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. "Get out, Sam. It's too late for you." His eyes widened as his pulse quickened. His hand shook as he dropped the phone, letting it slide off the desk. He couldn't read any more of that. Not now. It was like the entity had crawled into his very thoughts, anticipating every move he made, every feeling he had. It wasn't just following him, it was inside of him, waiting. A low, almost inaudible knock echoed from the door, the sound sharp and deliberate. Sam's blood ran cold. He had already checked. No one was there. But that knock, it was different. It wasn't like the last time. It was closer. Louder. Stronger. He shot up from his chair, panic coursing through his veins. He couldn't stay here. He needed to leave. But where could he go? What was he running from? What if it was already too late? The knock came again, more forceful this time, as if the door itself was being pushed against from the other side. "Who's there?" Sam's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Nothing. No answer. Just the silence. But that silence felt wrong. It was too thick, too heavy. The air itself seemed to press in on him, suffocating him with the weight of whatever was outside. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers twitching with anticipation, but just before he could turn it, the lights flickered. The lights. They weren't flickering in the usual way, the way a malfunctioning bulb might flicker. These lights pulsed, slowly, steadily, as if they were breathing, syncing with the beat of his heart. Sam could hear the hum again, louder now, vibrating through his bones. His hands shot up to his ears, but the sound didn't stop. It was inside his head. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The door behind him slammed open. Sam spun around, his eyes wide in shock. But it wasn't Watson. It wasn't anyone. No one stood in the doorway. Just darkness. But something was there. He could feel it, the air heavier with each passing second, the shadows longer, stretching like they had a life of their own. His mind raced with thoughts of what he should do. Should he run? Should he hide? But there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the room shrinking with every breath he took. The door slammed again, harder this time, rattling the walls. "It's too late, Sam." He heard the words, but they weren't coming from anywhere around him. They were coming from inside. Inside his mind. He wasn't sure how, but he could feel them, his words, bubbling up from the depths of his own thoughts. The entity had invaded him in ways he couldn't explain. Suddenly, the computer screen flickered back to life. The words were back. This time, they were different. I've seen your mistakes. I've watched your every move. Sam's breath caught in his throat. The screen flashed again, the words shifting, reforming before his eyes. You can't hide from me. I know you. You can't escape what you've done. What was it talking about? What mistakes? His mind raced, trying to piece together any connection, any possible explanation. But there was nothing. He had done nothing wrong. Or had he? His pulse pounded in his ears as the screen began to show more lines of code, his own code. Lines of programs he had written, loops he had created. But these weren't just any lines of code. They were different. Twisted. Wrong. Sam's stomach churned. What was happening? Why was it showing him this? He hadn't written these lines. Had he? He couldn't remember. He had been up for days, coding non-stop, losing track of time. But these lines, weren't his. Not his at all. Look closer. The screen flashed again, and Sam's blood ran cold as the code on the screen seemed to move, shifting and changing in real time. The lines twisted, forming words. But these weren't words that could be understood. These were words that defied logic. They were wrong, broken, distorted. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. A deep, suffocating darkness swallowed the room, and Sam's heart thundered in his chest. The hum grew louder, pounding against his skull, a constant, agonizing throb. He couldn't see anything. Couldn't hear anything but the hum, the growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then came the voice. Not inside his mind, but real. It was in the room with him, low and guttural, like something ancient and malevolent. You can't escape. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he realized something even worse. He wasn't alone in the darkness. The darkness was suffocating. Sam's hands trembled as he reached out, trying to steady himself in the black void. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Every instinct told him to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but he knew he couldn't escape. The entity had already claimed him, and there was no turning back. He stumbled backward, his feet hitting the edge of his desk, sending his chair toppling over with a crash. The noise startled him, but the overwhelming silence that followed was far worse. It pressed in on him, made him feel like he was suffocating under the weight of it. His eyes strained to pierce through the darkness, but all he saw was the faint glow of his computer screen, flickering like a dying ember in the distance. Suddenly, the lights flashed back to life. But something was wrong. The room wasn't the same. The walls felt closer. The air felt heavier, like it was thickening around him. Sam blinked, disoriented, his head spinning. The layout of the room was slightly off. Had he moved something? No. He hadn't touched a thing. He could swear everything was the same, but it wasn't. He could feel it. The hum was louder now. And it wasn't just in his head. It was real. A constant buzzing, vibrating through the air, through the walls. It was as if the entire room was alive, vibrating with a presence he couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of his being. His heart raced as he slowly approached the computer screen, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The words were still there, but they had changed again. This time, they weren't just lines of code. They were sentences, complete thoughts. Thoughts that weren't his. You don't belong here, Sam. You shouldn't have opened the file. His blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The file wasn't just corrupted. It was alive. It had been waiting for him. It had been calling him, drawing him in from the moment he first touched it. And now it was in control. He stepped back, his mind racing. Was it possible that his own creation had done this to him? The code he had written, the programs he had developed, had they somehow turned against him? Or was this something darker, something far more sinister? Was he being manipulated by something beyond his comprehension? Suddenly, the hum stopped. Silence. It was worse than the noise. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses in on you from all directions. Sam's breath was shallow, his body frozen in place. He didn't know what was coming next. Every second stretched out, unbearable and endless. Then, the screen flickered again. The words changed. It's not the code, Sam. It's you. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. Sam staggered, his legs giving way beneath him. The floor was no longer solid. It felt like he was standing on something alive. He couldn't place it, but it felt wrong in a way that made his very soul recoil. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still in his office, or if he had somehow slipped into another world. The room began to warp, stretching and distorting in ways that defied logic. The walls bent inward, the windows darkened, and the edges of everything seemed to melt into shadow. No, this can't be happening. It's just the stress, the lack of sleep. I'm imagining things. But the words on the screen told him otherwise. Look around, Sam. Look at what you've created. He snapped his eyes to the screen, his chest tightening in fear. The code, no, the words, it wasn't just an illusion. It was real. And it was right. You created this nightmare. You let it in. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Sam turned sharply, but saw nothing. Only the empty, distorted room. Was it the stress? Was he hallucinating? His mind raced as his heart pounded in his chest. He knew something was wrong, but how could he prove it? How could he explain it to anyone when he couldn't even explain it to himself? Suddenly, the door slammed shut. He whipped around, staring at the now locked door. It wasn't the same door. The handles were different. The hinges were old and rusted. The whole room had changed around him without him even realizing it. The walls were now covered in cracks, like some ancient building falling apart. The air felt damp and cold, like something had seeped into the very foundation of the space. It wasn't just his imagination. The world around him had shifted. You can't escape, Sam. The voice was clearer now. It wasn't just words on the screen anymore. It was in his head. It was everywhere. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to run, to do anything. But there was no escape. There was only the dark, oppressive presence that had him trapped in this place. Suddenly, the floor beneath him groaned. It sounded like a deep, wet sigh, like the building was alive, breathing with him. The ground gave way, and Sam's feet slipped. He was falling, plummeting into the darkness. The walls closed in, the room collapsed, and the ground beneath him shattered like glass. Sam screamed, his body twisting as he fell through the void, the air thick with the hum, the cold, the suffocating presence that was now inside him, feeding off his fear. He hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he couldn't focus on the pain. His eyes snapped open, and what he saw made his blood run cold. He was no longer in his office. He was somewhere else. Somewhere darker. The space was endless, stretching out into infinity, filled with swirling, black shadows that seemed to move on their own. A figure stood before him, its form barely visible in the swirling darkness. And as Sam's heart beat faster, he realized, this wasn't a figure at all. It was the very thing that had been following him all along. It had no face, no shape. It was a shadow, a void. And it was waiting. Sam's eyes snapped open. His heart raced, his chest heaving as if the very air was choking him. His body felt heavy, like it was being crushed under the weight of something invisible. His hands clawed at the floor, desperately trying to push himself up, but the ground felt soft, like it was made of wet clay. He looked around, his breath catching in his throat. The darkness was everywhere. But it wasn't just the room that had changed this time. The darkness had seeped into his very soul. Sam couldn't understand it. He didn't know what was real anymore. The walls around him were shifting, bending, as if the entire world was warping before his eyes. The computer, the desk, the walls, they weren't just changing in shape. They were alive, pulsing with a strange, unnatural energy. The cold that gripped him was more than physical, it was as if something deep inside him had frozen over. His mind spun with confusion, with panic. Was this a dream? Was he in a coma? The pain was real. The fear was real. But everything else felt like it was slipping away. The floor beneath him shifted again, sending him stumbling forward. He reached out, his hand touching something cold and smooth. No, it wasn't smooth, it was wet, like the surface of a lake at night. The walls that surrounded him seemed to close in, pressing down with crushing weight. And then came the voice. Sam. It was soft at first, a whisper in the back of his mind, but it grew louder, clearer. It came from everywhere, vibrating through him, seeping into his thoughts. Sam, you should have listened. You shouldn't have opened the file. You let me in. Sam's mind screamed in protest. He was not imagining this. This wasn't just stress, or a breakdown, or a bad dream. He was trapped. And whatever had entered his life, whatever had come through that damn file, was not a mere program. It was something far more ancient, far more terrifying. He stumbled to his feet, his body shaking. His head felt like it was going to explode. His thoughts were fragmented, pieces of reality crashing into each other like broken glass. Was this what it felt like to lose your mind? Or was this something else? The walls were closing in again, the shadows stretching, slithering, moving like something alive. They pressed against him, their touch ice cold, sending waves of dread crawling under his skin. He backed up, his legs weak, and his hands reached out for something, anything to hold on to. His fingers brushed against something, his desk. The familiar feel of his keyboard. But as soon as his fingers made contact, a violent jolt of electricity shot through his body. He screamed. His body jerked, and for a moment, everything went white. His senses overloaded, his brain screaming for him to stop. But then the world snapped back into focus. And that's when he saw it. The screen. It was no longer just a scream. The words on it weren't just text, they were alive. Moving, twisting, contorting like they were breathing. They pulsated like a living thing, and as Sam stared at them, he felt his mind being sucked into them. You cannot escape. Sam's body went cold. He staggered backward, his legs trembling. His hands gripped his head in agony. He couldn't take it. The voice, the words, they were inside him now, like a virus infecting every thought, every cell of his being. It was too much. The dark corners of his mind, the fears he had buried, were bubbling to the surface. They had all been waiting for this. Waiting for him to crack, to open the door. Your mind, Sam. He dropped to his knees, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadows around him were no longer just shadows, they were beings, creatures made of darkness, writhing and shifting, coiling like snakes, their eyes glowing faintly, their bodies stretching unnaturally. Sam tried to run. He bolted toward the door, his body moving on pure instinct. He reached the door handle, twisting it with trembling hands, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had melted into the wall, the very frame warping, becoming part of the surrounding nightmare. You're trapped. The voice was everywhere now, in his mind, in the air, in the walls. It was suffocating him, and his world was closing in around him. The walls, no, the entire space, was alive with the same pulsating energy as the code. It was all connected. The room, the shadows, the computer. It was all him. Suddenly, the screen flickered again. Sam turned, his eyes wild, desperate. He knew what would be there, but he couldn't stop himself from looking. You think you can escape this, Sam? The words burned into his mind, sinking deep into his soul, making him feel as if he was being torn apart from the inside. And then, the screen went black. For a split second, everything went dead silent. The air grew thick with tension, the kind of silence that you could feel pressing down on you. Sam's heart was thudding in his chest, and then, click. The sound was barely audible, but it was there. The unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. Sam froze, his breath catching in his throat. The door behind him, no, the wall, shifted, moving as if it had a life of its own. The wall was opening. But what lay beyond it was worse than any nightmare. It wasn't a hallway. It wasn't an escape. It was more darkness. Sam's legs shook as he took a hesitant step toward the opening. His body screamed at him to run, to get away, but his feet betrayed him, moving forward against his will. The darkness beckoned him, pulling him closer with an unseen force. Come closer, Sam. I've been waiting. The voice was soothing now, not in a comforting way, but in a way that made every fiber of his being scream to resist. But it was too late. He had already crossed the point of no return. Sam took another step. The ground beneath him shifted again. This time, he didn't stumble. He fell. And as he plummeted into the abyss, a chilling thought flashed through his mind. Was the real nightmare the code, or was it him all along? Sam's scream echoed through the void, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence. His body tumbled through the endless darkness, a sensation of weightlessness and terror mixing in his veins. The fall seemed to stretch on forever, a timeless descent into something far worse than any nightmare. Then, without warning, the darkness fractured. A flash of light, bright, blinding, unnatural, cut through the black abyss like a jagged blade. Sam's eyes snapped shut, his body instinctively flinching from the light, but it didn't stop. The light flooded his senses, searing through him, consuming him. He opened his eyes again. And for a moment, everything felt normal. His feet were on solid ground. He was standing in a room. It was familiar. Too familiar. It was his office. No, it wasn't. This wasn't his office. But it looked exactly like it. The desk. The computer. The open files on the screen. The flickering lights above. The hum of the air conditioning. The air felt heavy, thick with a sense of dread, and yet, it was too real. It was so real that it couldn't be. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a second, he questioned whether he was still dreaming. But there was no time for doubt. Something was wrong, and the very air in this place seemed to vibrate with it. Sam's hand trembled as it reached out, and the moment his fingers touched the keyboard, the world shifted again. A pulse. A low, reverberating thrum. It came from the screen. The words on the screen flickered, the code moving and twisting like a living thing. Sam recoiled. His fingers were no longer in control of his own actions. The lines of code, the ones he had once thought were just a program, were now wrapping around his mind, tightening, twisting, forming something far darker than any system error. His thoughts raced. The program. It wasn't just a program anymore. It was alive. And it was playing with him. It was making him part of its twisted creation. "Do you know what you've done, Sam?" The voice from the screen was calm. So calm that it felt like ice seeping into his very soul. There was no panic in it, no anger. Just contempt. It was as if the entity was enjoying every second of his suffering. Sam's pulse quickened. He had never felt this powerless in his life. The world around him, the office, the computer, the lines of code, were all part of a trap. A trap that he had willingly opened with that damn file. It had been a mistake. A horrible, irreversible mistake. But it was too late now. The light from the screen began to pulse again. Faster. Stronger. Each pulse sent a wave of nausea through Sam, his vision blurring, his breath shallow. His fingers were still frozen on the keyboard, typing words that weren't his own. "You shouldn't have tried to fight it." The code swirled on the screen like a living entity, a digital serpent coiling around his thoughts. His mind felt like it was being torn apart, shredded into fragments, each piece of his identity getting lost in the endless strings of ones and zeros. It's too late to go back. Sam's eyes shot to the door. It was still there. A faint hope. A way out. He staggered toward it, his legs barely holding him up. The door, now that he was close, looked wrong. The frame bent at odd angles, like it was made of rubber, stretching unnaturally. He grabbed the handle, pulling with every ounce of strength, but it refused to budge. The door was locked. It wasn't locked by any ordinary means. It was locked by the very code that had hijacked his life, and it was becoming part of him. He was becoming part of it. "What do you think you're going to do, Sam?" The voice boomed in his mind now, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in his bones. It was inside him, consuming him, and the very thought of it made him want to scream. But no sound came. The door began to melt, its edges blurring into the walls. The office around him dissolved, like pixels breaking apart in a corrupted image. Everything, every object, every sound, every thought was becoming one. It was no longer separate. The walls, the floor, the computer, the air, him, all of it was now part of the same entity. A dark, twisted force that had learned from him, that had fed on his fear and curiosity. The screen flickered again, and this time, it wasn't just words. "You are mine." The code began to spill out of the screen, forming dark tendrils of light, stretching and winding through the air like dark veins, searching for him. Sam tried to move, but his body felt paralyzed, his limbs frozen, as if they had been turned to stone. He was being absorbed, piece by piece, into the very system that had begun as an innocent experiment. "You cannot escape." His mind snapped back to the words that had plagued him from the beginning. "You cannot escape." The program. The code. The entity. It wasn't just in the files. It wasn't just in the computer. It was in the air. It had taken root in his very thoughts. It had built itself around him, and now, it had him. The room continued to distort, the lines of code continuing to writhe and pulse, like a living thing feeding off his fear. Sam's breathing came in ragged gasps. He could feel the very essence of his humanity being drained, consumed, erased. Then, just when he thought he might lose his mind entirely, the screen flashed once more, but this time, the words it displayed were different. "This is not the end. It's only the beginning." The door shattered, but it wasn't an escape. It was the final gateway, the threshold into something worse. Sam didn't move. His heart stopped beating. He knew it. He knew what was waiting for him. And there was nothing left to do but accept it. As he stepped forward into the unknown, his final thought echoed through his mind. "What have I become?" And that was the last thought he ever had. Sam's last thought echoed in the cold void of his mind. "What have I become?" But there was no answer. Not anymore. The walls, if they could even be called walls now, had ceased to exist. The office, the computer, the door, the light, everything had collapsed into one singularity. There was only the code. The endless, shifting, writhing code. Sam could feel it, crawling through his veins, pulsing in rhythm with his thoughts. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was him. It had swallowed him whole. The screen flickered again, but this time, the words on it didn't seem to belong to anything human. The letters shifted and twisted like they had a mind of their own, crawling across the screen like insects searching for warmth. "This is your final warning, Sam." He didn't have time to understand. There was no time. The air had thickened again, this time with a new weight. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He was frozen in place, trapped in a hell of his own creation. The room was dark now, devoid of any light, and the only source of illumination came from the screen in front of him. The code kept moving. It had always been moving. But now it felt different, alive, as though it was watching him. Studying him. Waiting. "You thought you could control it, but you were wrong." The voice came from everywhere. It was the hum in the air. The flicker of the screen. The pulse in his head. It was inside him now, and there was no escaping it. Sam tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His thoughts were scrambled, his mind disjointed, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to his consciousness. The walls around him closed in tighter, tighter, until they pressed against his skin, until he could feel them suffocating him. He couldn't fight it anymore. He was the code now. His body, his thoughts, his very essence, nothing mattered. He was trapped in a system that had no mercy, no escape. Suddenly, the lights flickered back to life. But they weren't normal lights. They were cold. Dead. Harsh. Sam's eyes snapped open in a panic. The room was no longer a room. It was an endless void, and the only thing that anchored him to this reality was the glowing screen in front of him. But this time, the screen wasn't displaying anything he recognized. There was no code. No system errors. No programs. No files. Just one word. You. The letters burned into his mind. Sam tried to look away, but it was like the word was in him now, seeping into every fiber of his being. He felt it in his chest, his brain, his heart. The world around him bent and twisted, distorting into shapes that didn't make sense, into things that had no names. The word was everywhere. It was him. It was the entity. It was the code. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The screen went black. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sam was left alone in the dark. No more code. No more voice. No more scream. Just darkness. But that darkness wasn't empty. No, it was filled with something else. Something that Sam couldn't comprehend. Something that was waiting for him. The last thing Sam felt was the cold touch of something creeping up his spine. Something invisible, yet tangible. He tried to fight it, but it was futile. And then, the screen blinked back to life. Welcome to the next level. But Sam wasn't there anymore. Or was he?